The Heirs of Wychcombe Hall. Chapter 1. A House of Prospects and Tempers. Wychcombe Hall stood upon a gentle rise, its honeyed stone warm even under a pewter sky. Within, old portraits turned their patient faces toward the door, as if they had waited these many years to see who would come to disturb the equilibrium of their quiet reign. Sir Peregrine Ashcombe, the proprietor, bachelor, baronet, and benevolent tyrant of his domain, liked the feeling of being watched by those who had preceded him. It kept him, he said, from mistaking his present comfort for eternal security. In the late winter of 1817, two nephews, gentlemen cousins though not brothers, arrived almost together. Mr. Edward Ashcombe came first, early in the afternoon, his travel-stained coat and modest equipage suggesting prudence rather than penury. 3 hours later, Mr. Henry Lascelles rolled into the courtyard with a dash that set the stable boys whispering and the housemaids peeping through the buttery door. He had a tiger behind and a gleam in his eye which assured the world that life had meant to be kind to him and had done its best to keep its word. Sir Peregrine rose from his chair as Edward entered the library. Years had stiffened the baronet's joints, but sharpened his eye. He saw in a moment the characteristic neatness with which Edward had ordered his papers on the hall table, and the care with which he closed the door to keep out the draught. "Edward, welcome back. Wychcombe is steadier for your tread upon its floors," said Sir Peregrine, offering his hand with a warmth that had nothing of flattery. Edward bowed with the quiet sincerity that belonged to him. "You are kind, sir." The road from Bath was heavy with ruts. "I have gained a new respect for your overseer's judgment in the matter of southern drainage." Sir Peregrine chuckled. "Take care. If you begin with drains, you will end in my will." He watched the faint colour rise in his nephew's face and was satisfied. Embarrassment is a good sign in a young man who might wish to inherit. He turned his head as wheels rattled upon the gravel. Ah, Henry arrives like a cavalry charge. Henry did not enter the library so much as occupy it. His bow before his uncle was deferential enough. His smile was dazzling. And when Miss Clara Denham, Sir Peregrine's ward, came in with a shy composure that could never be taught, Henry's attention flew to her as though the sun had changed its place in the sky. "Miss Denham," said he, "I am not surprised Wychcombe is reputed to have a fine collection of paintings. It always did know how to frame a subject." Clara flushed and laughed, in that order, a sequence which pleased Henry excessively. Edward contented himself with an inclination, and Clara, who lacked vanity but not perception, observed that while Henry made her an offering of words, Edward spared her the trouble of receiving them. The household was small, an old butler named Luton, who regarded the house and its master as one organism. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, whose devotion to cleanliness had nearly ruined the polish on the banisters, a steward, Mr. Talbot, with a scholar's stoop and a yeoman's sense, 6 indoor servants besides, and outside an army of gardeners, grooms and farmhands who answered to the name of Wychcombe as sailors do to their ship. Sir Peregrine had been guardian to Clara since the death of her father, Captain Denham, a man of fine feeling and little fortune, 10 years previously. She was not a showy beauty. The curve of her cheek was made for candlelight rather than ballroom chandeliers. The grey of her eyes had a touch of violet only when she was moved to laughter or pity. She possessed what the gossips of the village, who loved her, called a peaceable way, and what Sir Peregrine, who adored her, called a conscience. It was rumoured, by those same gossips and by a few ambitious mothers, that Sir Peregrine meant to leave Wychcombe to the nephew who could best combine a steady head with a tender heart toward Miss Denham. The estate was not entailed. The county knew the baronet's will was as free as his purse, and many an alehouse conversation found its peroration in a prophecy of the next master's name. Within a week, the pattern of life revealed itself. Edward rose early, rode out with Mr. Talbot to inspect hedgerows and talk of turnpike repairs, wrote letters on Sir Peregrine's business with a hand neat enough to flatter the paper, and spent odd half-hours in the schoolroom examining the accounts of the charity that Sir Peregrine and Clara had revived. Henry rose later, though never late enough to be taxed with indolence, read 2 pages of a book and talked of it for 20 minutes, organised a party to see the Cascades, practised a song with Clara in the evening, and flattered Mrs. Pell so artfully that she afterward confided to the kitchen maid that Mr. Lascelles had not one atom of pride, or if he had, 'twas of the right sort, like the bloom upon an apricot. The cousins bore themselves with civility. Rivalry sharpened them without yet embittering either. Henry excelled at first impressions, Edward at remaining in favour once the impression was past. Clara, finding kindness in both, dared not choose. Sir Peregrine, who loved to observe where he could not openly direct, announced one morning that the lower meadows, sodden after a winter of storms, must be reclaimed, and that he would consider with particular attention any plan his nephews might propose for the improvement. "Practical genius wins my ear," said he, tapping his cane, "but I do not insist on genius where good sense will serve." Henry smiled. "You make the test too easy, sir. Edward will carry it with good sense alone." "And you?" asked the baronet, amused. "I must throw myself upon your mercy, and upon the meadows," said Henry, which earned a light from Clara's eyes and an indulgent cough from Sir Peregrine. For a week, Edward studied the ground with Mr. Talbot. He spoke to tenants, measured gradients, calculated costs, and discovered that a certain brook, if persuaded by a modest bank and culvert, would do more for the meadow than the most eloquent pamphlet. Henry, meanwhile, read that very pamphlet, an essay on the hygrometric virtues of ditches, and adorned it with marginalia in a hand so elegant that the author himself might have envied it. He talked of sluices like a poet and of labourers like a philanthropist, and composed for Clara's benefit a clever little verse on the heroic labours of spades. When, in due course, each presented his scheme, Sir Peregrine let them speak without interruption. Henry sparkled. Edward supported his plain language with figures that would have stood a cross-examination in Chancery. Sir Peregrine dismissed them with thanks, and that evening was found, candle in hand, reading Edward's estimate over again in his study. He did not name a victor, but 2 days later Mr. Talbot received orders to mark out a bank precisely where Edward had recommended. "I suppose," said Henry lightly to Clara, "that my ditch will do very well in a poem, if not in a meadow." "Poems are never wasted," she replied kindly. "Only, meadows are stubborn critics." "She says I am all metaphor," Henry told himself, half in jest and half in alarm. "I must cultivate a crop of facts." Thus, the campaign began, duty against display, patience against brilliance, and the House, though outwardly serene, learned to recognise the movement of the contest the way an old clock knows the hour by the feel of its own pendulum. Chapter 2. The Gallery, the Vicarage, and a Ball at Haverley. Clara's favourite retreat was the Long Gallery, where the family portraits kept their counsel, and the windows were so deep that one might sit within them as upon a throne. She liked best, of all those calm faces, the portrait of a young lady in a simple white gown, painted with less flattery than was usual a century earlier. A little tablet beneath the frame recorded her as Elizabeth Denham, née Villiers, beloved of this house though she died early. It was a delicate bond between Clara and the place. Somewhere in the tangled branches of lineage, a Denham had joined her fate to an Ashcombe, and the house seemed to recognise in Clara a quiet return. Henry found her there one evening, and instead of talking of her beauty, chose, wisely, to talk of the portrait. "She does not look like a lady who required an army of flatterers," said he, "nor like one who would have endured them." Clara smiled. "Sir Peregrine says she steadied a husband who needed steadying. He prefers ladies who improve houses, not merely decorate them." "Then I despair," Henry replied, though with gentleness rather than gallantry. "I am more shade than substance in a gallery." She turned towards him. "I think you have substance enough, Mr. Lascelles, if you could be easy without applause." He laughed, not at her but at himself, a sound that did him good. If Wychcombe could hear that and clap, I should be cured at once. That is not ease, Clara said, but she said it softly. Henry went away unusually quiet and found Edward in the library cutting quills. The sight of that domestic industry provoked him as no sermon could. "Are you always so content to be useful?" he demanded. "Not always content," said Edward, "but convinced. Usefulness is love's native tongue." "Love," echoed Henry. "You speak as if we were apprentices to a heart." Edward looked up, eyes steady. "We are apprentices to something." If Henry liked not the answer, it was because his own conscience admitted the claim. Spring, which had delayed as if to test the county's patience, now arrived with a tenderness that compensated for its tardiness. The hedgerows showed green. The willows trailed their pale tresses into the brook. One might fancy that if a harp were strung out of doors, the air itself would play it. Sir Peregrine, whose rheumatism slept only in warm weather, declared himself fit to visit the vicarage school and insisted that both nephews should attend him and Clara. The vicar, Mr. March, was a lean man with bright eyes and thin patience. He loved children enough to be amused by their mischief and adults enough to be disappointed by their follies. He had, to Clara's practised sympathy, a wife of delicate constitution and an income that refused to be ambitious. The schoolroom possessed more good intentions than slates. The older boys could mend a fence and the younger could spoil a penknife, and Clara's weekly attendance meant that the sum of their good behaviour, like a ledger carefully kept, seldom fell too far into the red. On the day of the visit, a small crisis welcomed them. Two boys, Tom Davy and Will Greaves, had quarrelled over a book's possession with such ardour that one poor volume might have served both as reward and weapon. Mr. March, with the diplomacy of a man who must be judge and jury before tea, had separated them and now looked to Sir Peregrine for a demonstration of justice. Henry, with admirable spirit, set the boys to a recitation on the virtue of temperance, which they delivered with an attention that was not wholly to the sense. Edward, with less display, sat beside the smallest urchin and mended his slate frame. Then he contrived to make Tom and Will change places, Tom finishing Will's problem, Will finishing Tom's, until each learned how foolish he had been to despise the other's labour. Sir Peregrine observed the methods and afterward said to Mr. Talbot, "Henry makes a clever speech to a vice. Edward gives a task to a boy." Clara thought of neither speech nor task, but of the relief on Mr. March's face when Edward privately pressed upon him an envelope, ostensibly a subscription to the school, in fact a month's respite from anxiety. "Do not tell Sir Peregrine," Edward whispered. "Only buy Mrs. March some wine." "If I do not tell Sir Peregrine," answered the vicar with a twinkle, "it is because he will find out and scold me for keeping secrets." In April, the county assembled for a ball at Haverley House. Clara went in a gown of white muslin with a narrow lilac ribbon, simplicity itself. Henry in particular discovered that simplicity can be the most extravagant luxury when it belongs to a mind that neither seeks nor spurns admiration. Edward, whose dancing was competent but not remarkable, would have sacrificed the whole evening's set to spare Clara fatigue. Henry would have danced with her until the candles wept themselves out, and the musicians threatened insurrection. Between dances, talk ran, how could it not, on Sir Peregrine's intentions. A certain Mrs. Barton, expert in conjecture and charitable in nothing else, announced that the baronet had all but settled Wychcombe upon Henry, for he has the air of a man born to spend her neighbour, less acid and more intelligent, replied that Sir Peregrine liked men born to save. The debate might have become lively, had not the subject of it walked by with Miss Denham on his arm, to the instant silencing of every tongue and the slow growth of a more generous rumour, that the prettiest pair in the room were engaged in everything but name. Yet the evening supplied another note. Near midnight, as people began to depart, a shower burst upon the roof and turned the stone terrace into a mirror of rain. Clara and Edward were halfway to the portico when a small girl, one of the tenant family's children who had been permitted to look on at the finery, slipped from her mother's hand and skittered toward the steps. Henry sprang forward with more gallantry than wisdom. He reached the child, snatched her up, and bounded back, then nearly fell himself upon the slick stone. Edward, a moment behind, steadied Henry's arm without ceremony and took the child. Clara threw her shawl over the little creature's bare head. The mother sobbed gratitude, and the incident ended with Henry's laugh, charming and a shade forced. "Bravo," said Sir Peregrine afterward, when the story reached him. "Henry saved the child, and Edward saved Henry. An allegory for the county." "I do not desire to be saved," Henry muttered, not altogether in jest. "Make it unnecessary, then," said his uncle, not altogether in jest either. Chapter 3. Letters, Loyalties, and a Night of Reckoning. The post arrived at Wychcombe with the sort of irregular regularity by which Providence reproves human impatience. One Tuesday in May, when the Hawthorns were in their pomp, a letter bearing the seal of a London attorney came among the usual merchants' invoices and charitable petitions. By mischance, or by a chain of small choices which, taken together, set more weight upon the scale than anyone would have credited, the attorney's letter was placed upon Henry's tray. He would not, in cold reflection, have opened what was not his. In warm curiosity and a wish to be useful, he broke the seal. The contents made his breath catch. The attorney wrote that he had examined, at Sir Peregrine's request, the affairs of the Colne Navigation and Improvement Company, an undertaking in which Sir Peregrine had once invested and from which he now suspected mismanagement. The attorney lamented to find the suspicion justified. There was cause to think fraud had been practised. He added, in what he called the interest of candour and what Henry privately called the mischief of officiousness, that a gentleman of your family, Mr. Edward Ashcombe, did at an earlier period urge your continued subscription as prudent. Henry stood very still. It was startling. It was useful. It might, if handled dexterously, promote his own interest, not by calumny, but by presenting what had the appearance of fact. He carried the letter to Sir Peregrine with a seriousness that looked like virtue and was, in truth, only its mask. The baronet read the paper. His hand tightened on the seal. "Send Mr. Edward to me," said he. Edward came, with the sort of untroubled expression which either springs from innocence or the perfect control of guilt. Sir Peregrine held out the letter. "Explain this." Edward read. He looked from the page to his uncle. His composure did not alter. "The gentleman is mistaken, sir. 2 years ago I wrote advising you to dispose of the shares. If you will allow me an hour, I will produce my letters. They are in your strong box. I kept copies." Henry coloured. Shame pricked him, even as hope whispered that copies could be forged and dates contrived. "Cousin," he said lightly, "you make your defence too good. No man can testify for himself." Edward turned to him with a steadiness almost severe. "A man must testify for his conscience. Other witnesses are a luxury." He bowed to his uncle and left the room. Henry, in the silence that followed, found the tick of the mantel clock intolerable. Within the hour, Edward returned with 2 letters in his hand. They were brief, businesslike, and, most awkward of all, dated unmistakably in Edward's neat figures and in Sir Peregrine's own docketing hand. The second, more pointed than the first, warned that rumours of the Colne Company's management had grown darker. Edward advised withdrawal. Sir Peregrine laid the papers upon the desk and fixed his gaze upon Henry with a mixture of sorrow and disappointment, which Henry was man enough to endure but not enough to forget. "You acted from zeal," said the baronet at last, "and zeal is not a sin. But curiosity is a cousin to mischief, and if you bring me accusations, Henry, make certain they do not crumple in your hand when the light is turned upon them." Henry bowed. "I am corrected, sir?" He was more than corrected. He was wounded in that part of a proud man where pain becomes counsel. The shame of having been the carrier of a falsehood, however nobly intended, ate at him. He went out into the park and walked until the last light left the west. When he returned, he was weary enough to keep his tongue from rashness. Clara, who had heard only that an unhappy misunderstanding had been set right, met Henry on the staircase. "Mr. Lascelles," she said gently, "I hope you are not unwell." "Only too well," he answered. And seeing that his smile disturbed her, he checked gaiety with effort. "Pray make your mind easy. I am better fitted for the world than for Wychcombe, and the world will be the better for my company." "You are not leaving?" The question escaped her before discretion had time to catch it. He paused, and then, in a tone as frank as she had ever heard from him, replied, "For a little while. I am not the man to prosper by daily comparison with a better. I should like to come back with one virtue that is my own." Clara's eyes grew soft. "You have many. Not one that does not go lame before Mr. Edwards. But I thank you for the charity of your vision." The next morning Henry departed, not dramatically but with order. He left notes of thanks for Mrs. Pell and Mr. Talbot. He pressed a coin into the palm of Tom Davy, the very boy whose quarrel had troubled the schoolroom, and told him to buy a book and quarrel with the author instead. He kissed Sir Peregrine's hand and permitted Edward to accompany him to the carriage. "Cousin," he said as he took his seat, "you have made truth look handsomer than I supposed it could be." "Keep it so." Edward answered merely, "Come back soon." After Henry's going, Wychcombe settled into a peace profound enough to be felt by the very furniture. Edward and Clara worked side by side without declaring what it was they were building. The vicarage school gained new desks, the lower meadow began to dry and green under Edward's modest engineering. Sir Peregrine, who monitored their efforts with the grave pleasure of a gardener who sees his young plants taking root, made no more tests. He had observed enough. The summer fete, Clara's scheme, Sir Peregrine's purse, Edward's logistics, brought villagers and gentry together upon the lawns. Laughter travelled lightly through the tents. The brass warming pan, polished to a blinding state by Mrs. Pell, was awarded as a prize to the best cottage loaf. Children raced with spoons and eggs in a degree of concentrated agony that moved even the vicar to mirth. Henry's absence was felt, if only because his presence would have supplied jest and ceremony, yet the day did not need spectacle. Toward evening, a shower brewed over the hills and broke with a will, sending everyone to shelter. Clara, trying to see that the smallest were under canvas, misstepped upon the slick turf and would have fallen had not Edward, who had observed her from a distance with the eye he kept for hazards that threatened her alone, reached her. His hand on her arm steadied her. The two of them stood, for an instant that felt like an oath, within the blur of rain. Clara did not speak, neither did Edward. They were both too honest to employ words where truth had already taken possession. That night, Sir Peregrine sat later than usual at his writing table. He drew sheets toward him and wrote a series of memoranda. Once he paused to consult a drawer and took from it a miniature, a girl with brown eyes and courage in the set of her mouth, Clara's mother, painted years before by a traveller who had needed money and found gratitude instead. Sir Peregrine replaced the miniature with a tenderness that belonged to another life, then rang for Luton. "Send for Mr. Redmayne in the morning," said he. "I will have my will drawn at once." "Very good, Sir Peregrine," replied Luton, who had been butler long enough to know that when the baronet said "at once," he meant before Providence has another idea. The attorney arrived. The will was drawn. Witnesses were found among the indoor staff, and Wychcombe Hall had a future as secure as paper and wax could make it. Sir Peregrine did not immediately tell either nephew or ward the particulars. He had, perhaps, a desire to watch a little longer the theatre of content without the disturbance of applause. But Providence, who respects wills only when their makers are humble, had one more scene to stage before the curtain fell. Late in September, news drifted from London that the Colner Navigation Company, not content with being exposed, had collapsed with sufficient noise to wake the dead. Several gentlemen of the county had been injured. Stories of ruined widows appeared in the papers, none of which were the less moving because some were exaggerated by print. Among those who had once urged the scheme upon the public was a certain Mr. Barham, a flashy projector whose brougham had too often stopped at Wychcombe for Sir Peregrine's taste. The baronet expressed himself upon the subject with the force of a man who hates imprudence less than he hates deceit. 2 days later, Henry returned. He came without trumpets, thin with travel, and possessed of a new gravity that suited him almost as well as his coat. Sir Peregrine received him in the library. Henry went down upon one knee, not with extravagance, but with the feeling that confession sometimes requires ritual. "Sir," said he, "forgive me, not for the opening of a letter, which was an accident covered by folly, but for the spirit that made me a collector of weapons instead of a servant of truth. I wish to begin again with no resource but honour." Sir Peregrine, who could have made a good bishop if bishops were permitted impatience, lifted him up. "Stand, Henry. No man supplicates me who requires a sermon. Have you eaten?" "I can, if you will allow me to do so as a penitent." "You shall eat as a nephew. Afterward you may disclose your penances to Mr. March." Henry laughed then, a laugh that owed nothing to vanity. His eye met Edward's across the room. He held out his hand. Edward took it. Clara, when Henry bowed to her with a humility she had never seen in him before, felt the small sudden bruise lift from her heart where his restlessness had once struck it. That night, rain again, and the house listening to it, Henry walked the long gallery alone and stopped before the portrait of Elizabeth Villiers. "Madam," he said to the painted lady, "I am going to attempt steadiness." The lady, who had tried more difficult things, looked as if she consented. Chapter 4. The Worthier Heir, the Wedding, and What Came After. October found Sir Peregrine failing. It was not an illness severe in symptom. His physician spoke of a general contraction of the powers. "The springs are sound," said the doctor, "but they wind down." Sir Peregrine disliked being likened to a clock, but accepted the diagnosis with the grace he allowed to all facts that would not be argued with. He slept more, talked less, and kept Clara's hand often in his. One afternoon he summoned Edward and Henry to his chamber. The window admitted a gentle light through curtains of faded damask. The fire made a faithful sound. Clara sat in a low chair beside the bed, not weeping. She had wept the week before, and would again, but ready for whatever service the next minute required. "My boys," said the baronet, "I am like a captain who sees the shore and would rather see the ship to harbour than enjoy the view. I shall not detain you with reflections. I have put them in order among my papers. I desire only to say what the heart cannot leave unsaid." He turned to Henry. "You have courage enough to be good, have patience to be excellent. The world will forgive your wit if you teach it to trust your word." "I will try, sir," said Henry, and meant it. Sir Peregrine's gaze moved to Edward. "You have made service appear a pleasure, which is either art or grace. I believe it is grace. I will not flatter you by saying that Wychcombe cannot stand without you, only that it will be most itself in your keeping." He looked toward Clara and took her fingers in his. "Child, I have made a will. Mr. Redmayne will tell you its particulars when I am gone, but I shall tell you the heart of it now. If you can love Edward, marry him. If not, take what I have left you, and bestow your goodness where you will. I should like to see you both at the hearth that I have warmed." Clara bent, kissed the old man's hand, and whispered what even Edward, standing near, did not hear. Sir Peregrine smiled and closed his eyes, as if to rest upon that whisper. He lived another fortnight and then, without struggle or ceremony, went where men of charity have always gone. The reading of the will contained nothing of surprise to those who knew the house. Wychcombe Hall, its farms, its moneys and obligations, went to Edward Ashcombe, a handsome portion, independent and immediate, to Clara Denham, substantial legacies to Henry Lascelles, to Luton, to Mr. Talbot and Mrs. Pell, funds for the vicarage school sufficient to secure it a new roof and a master who could spell. There was also a letter for Edward, private, to be read once and destroyed, which he did in the orchard, with tears that left no stain. Mourning altered the colour, but not the motion of life. Edward moved into the duties of mastership as a man steps forward in a dance he has long practised. He signed papers, he refused flattery, he rode out to the cottages most likely to be overlooked, he forgave an arrear when he must, and refused it when forgiveness would have punished diligence. Henry, true to his vow, remained at Wychcombe through the winter, not as a guest to be entertained, but as a kinsman to be useful. He discovered, to his astonishment and relief, that usefulness, so dull in prospect, has a way of becoming a game in practice. He coaxed a recalcitrant tenant back into sobriety by placing him in charge of the very threshers he had idled. He turned a Christmas assembly into an opportunity for subscriptions to the Widows' Fund. He made Tom Davy, now 15 and obstinate, responsible for the school's firewood, and suffered him to boast of it, which did Tom more good than any lecture upon humility. Clara watched, grateful beyond words. Her own mourning was of that deepest sort, quiet, active, and resolved to honour the dead by consoling the living. She wrote to Captain Denham's old comrades. She ordered blankets for cottages where shame would not let the fire be fed. She kept the baronet's dogs, who understood perfectly what had been lost, from grieving themselves into illness. And she learned the exact distance at which to walk beside Edward so that without touching her hand, he could feel that hers was near. January brought snow. February, a thaw of the sort that turns lanes into confessions. In March, Edward asked Mr. March, who enjoyed an honest joke above any long sermon, to walk with him up to the ridge above the east meadow, where the view takes in fields, church tower, and the far line where road meets sky. Clara came, invited as if by chance, though every detail of the party had been planned by Edward with a care that would have furnished a treaty. "I have a question for you, Miss Denham," he said at last, when Mr. March had graciously found himself interested in a lark and had drifted out of earshot. "You may ask anything, Mr. Ashcombe," said Clara. She meant it. He removed his hat and looked not at her, but at the land, those fields that were no longer Sir Peregrine's but his, and that would be most truly his if they were hers too. "Your guardian granted me 2 trusts, his estate and your happiness. I know how to tend the first because he taught me. For the second I have only my heart to speak for me. Will you, by your own free will, join your fortunes to mine?" Clara might have answered with a word, and the word was ready, but she was made for fairness. "I could, from this moment to the end of my life, be proud to call myself your wife. Yet there is Henry." "You are compassionate," Edward said, and loved her the more. "Henry has compassion enough to wish me joy, and pride enough to feel it. Will he be happy? It is a promise that no man should make for another. But I think he will be engaged, if not with felicity, then with honour, and honour has a way of inviting felicity." Clara laughed, softly, for joy is shy at first when it has been long expected. "Then yes." The word, having waited, had acquired a power that astonished even the one who spoke it. Mr. March, who, despite his drift, had ears that collected happiness at a distance, turned back with his eyes suspiciously bright and his nose suspiciously cold. He made them both repeat the essentials for his legal satisfaction, and then offered, on the spot, to read the banns himself, which he afterward did with a solemnity that persuaded half the village they had been personally engaged by Providence to rejoice. Henry, when told, did indeed wish them joy. He did more. He made himself necessary to the wedding preparations. He argued Mrs. Pell out of tassels. He procured, by some wizardry with a London friend, a music book of duets that Clara had once admired in a catalogue and then forgotten. I am cured of being the subject, he told Edward that evening over brandy. Let me be the chorus, and I shall sing in tune. You will be the chorus of more than one life, said Edward. I have had a letter from Mr. Berridge at the Foreign Office. He thinks there is a place for a man who speaks French without sneering and rides to an appointment without lying about it afterward. Diplomacy? Heaven defend the chancelleries, Henry laughed. But I will try my hand at honesty abroad if it agrees so well with me at home. The wedding took place in June, when the limes were sweet and the bees industrious. It was not grand, it was perfect. Clara wore sprigs of rosemary among her ribbons. Edward, standing beside her, looked like a man who has shaken hands with fortune and discovered that her palm is warm. Sir Peregrine would have approved the congregation, which included the farmer who had once argued too loudly at a rent audit and had been forgiven. Mrs. Barton, who wept copiously and later declared the tears had been foreseen in her earliest prophecy, and Tom Davy, who carried a prayer book with such solemn pride that one feared for its safety. There was dancing upon the lawn after. Mr. March offered a toast full of good humour and better scripture. Mrs. Pell permitted the kitchen to pillage her store of currants. Henry waltzed with the vicar's wife for as long as her breath allowed, then contrived to stand near the gate at parting time so that he might see every smile twice, once coming, once going. At sunset, when the last carriage had rolled away, Edward and Clara walked the terrace under a sky that had invented a new colour for the hour and could not name it. Home, Clara said. Home, Edward agreed, and neither of them needed to explain how a word can be both a place and a promise. Henry left for London a week later, carrying with him letters of introduction and a determination to keep at least one resolution for every mile of the road. His last act at Wychcombe was to visit the Long Gallery, where he stood again before the portrait of Elizabeth Villiers. Madam, he said under his breath, I have the beginnings of steadiness. Pray for continuation. The painted lady, who had steadied more than one husband and son in her day, maintained her silence, perhaps because where she now resided, prayers were arranged in an order to which earthly etiquette could not aspire. Years do their best work quietly. Under Edward's hand, Wychcombe prospered, not by sudden improvements that make a neighbouring estate jealous, but by steady opportunities offered to those willing to be steady. Tenants discovered that their landlord's forgiveness was most abundant where effort preceded excuse. The vicar found that subscriptions arrived in January as frequently as in December. Mr. Talbot retired with the unusual felicity of seeing his successor trained before his eyes. Clara's charities multiplied without advertisement. The school acquired maps and a globe. The Widows' Fund became an institution not subject to weather. Henry, from Vienna and then from Brussels, wrote letters so entertaining that one forgot to notice they were also conscientious. He discovered that a man who cannot be bought is in constant request, where there are goods perpetually for sale. Twice he visited Wychcombe. Twice he stood in the doorway at twilight and smiled at the sight of the lamplight making a quiet promise of the house. I could envy, he told Clara once, if I were not so busy admiring. Admiration is the prettier envy, she replied, and the safer. When their first child was born, a daughter, with Sir Peregrine's obstinate mouth and Clara's untroubled eyes, Henry sent a silver rattle from across the channel and a letter so affectionate that Edward, reading it, held the page for a moment against his heart. The child grew to toddle in the Long Gallery and make faces at ancestors who had never seen a nursery. The house accepted this indignity as further proof that posterity, when it laughs, means to stay. On an evening in autumn, the last day of a harvest which had satisfied even the most exacting farmer, Edward brought Clara to the ridge above the East Meadow, where he had first asked her to share the burdens which had proved themselves to be blessings. The brook below ran in its appointed course between modest banks. The culvert murmured of industry rather than of brilliance. Cattle, patient and unideological, declared the grass excellent by consuming it. "Do you remember?" he asked. I remember, she said. The meadows, the letter, the rain on the terrace. I have sometimes wondered whether happiness begins with crisis or with duty. With truth, Clara answered. Crisis reveals it, duty practices it. He smiled and took her hand. Then we are rich. They walked home as the first star came out. Luton, at the door, regarded them with the superior pleasure of a retainer whose house has done its duty in producing a succession. Mrs. Pell, somewhere in the back, lectured a pie into perfection. Mr. Talbot, by his fire, wrote the day's last figure and set down his pen in a satisfaction that had nothing to do with arithmetic. And Wychcombe Hall, which had seen many claimants and would see many more, kept its character. A place where fortune followed virtue, but never ran ahead of it, where brilliant spirits were welcomed when they had learned to prefer honour to applause, and where a young woman with a peaceable way was loved, not for adorning a gallery, but for steadying a home. The moral, if anyone requires it, is simple. Wealth without integrity is a patron who will not pay. Charm without conscience is a carriage without a brake. And love, when it chooses humbly, inherits more than lands. It inherits a future. The end. If you've enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and quiet courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear our next Regency romance on the Regency Gazette channel. Thank you for listening.